Hi guys. So today we are going to talk about the home front during World War One. Now, I apologize if there's a bit of a lag between my video and the audio. That just sometimes happens with Screencastify when we are actually recording. So I apologize about that, but hopefully it gets better as the slideshow goes on. So like I said, today we are looking at the home front during the First World War. So the first part of the slideshow is a fill-in-the-blank slideshow. So you should have this video opened up in one tab, and then in another tab, you should have your own copy of the home front slideshow. Throughout this slideshow, you will see terms, phrases, sentences underlined, and you are going to take what I have on my video here and put it into your slideshow. So at the end, you will have a complete note. Now that is the first half of this slideshow about the home front. The second half is more independent activities for you to do, and I'll discuss those with you as well once we're there. So let's get started. So throughout this video, I want you to think of a couple of things. I want you to think of to what extent do these actions or events on the home front represent things to make you proud? So keep this idea in the back of your head as we go through this slideshow. How do these actions make you proud? There we go. And now I want you to start discussing some of these minds-on questions over in the discussions area on D2L. So if you head there now, you'll be able to see a discussions area open for you to go over some of your answers to these questions. So the questions are, what do you know about how Canadians on the home front contributed to the war effort? So what do you already know? How should these contributions be commemorated? So how should we remember what was done on the home front? And how are our actions, responses, and decisions remembered and commemorated across Canada? So how are they already commemorated? So these are questions that I want you to answer now before we get on with the rest of the slideshow, because these are your initial thoughts, and your thoughts might change as we move throughout the slideshow. So pause this video for a second, go do your discussion in D2L. Okay, so now let's look at the home front. So the home front was very much involved in the First World War, and the First World War as a whole can be called total war. So total war, you see the definition of it here, includes four things: mobilization, the refusal to compromise, the blurring of roles between soldiers and civilians, and total control of society. So we see mobilization with the sending of troops overseas and the battles that we've already discussed throughout this class. The refusal to compromise, so we look at how long this war was. The war was not a short war. It was not over by Christmas. It took them quite a long time, 4 years to be exact, to actually get to a conclusion. Today, we are going to really discuss the blurring of roles between soldier and civilians, and how civilians on the home front very much participated in the war in their own way. And we're also going to talk about how it was a total control of society. So the war itself was not an isolated thing over in Europe. It wasn't just a problem in France that the French people had to deal with. No. It reached us here in Canada, and it was something that everyone was involved in, and it was something that everyone took part in their own way. So that's what we're going to discuss today, the home front, and how it added to this idea of total war. So when you hear total war, think of the war being all-encompassing. It's not just on the battlefield, it's also at home. So, of course, when we talk about the home front, especially during this time period, we do have to talk about women's roles within the war. Women were fairly limited on what they were allowed to do in the war, and because we could not take on actual physical combat roles, they participated in the war in different ways. So women stepped into traditionally male jobs. So these male jobs tended to be munition factories, office work, and heavy labor on farms. So these were jobs that traditionally men would do because they were deemed dangerous, or it was thought that women weren't strong enough to do them, or it wasn't an appropriate environment for a woman. However, when the war broke out and men started enlisting, all of a sudden they were leaving their posts at home. They were leaving the factory jobs. They were leaving the farm jobs. They were leaving their office jobs. Postal workers left, trolley drivers left, streetcar drivers left. All of these people left to go fight in wars, but society still has to go on. So somehow we had to find ways to fill these roles. And the only people that were really left on the home front were women, children, the elderly, and anyone who was unable to fight. So the women really stepped into these roles and took on what were considered traditionally male roles. Now, when they were on the farms, they were called farmettes, just to kind of make it a little more feminine in the words for them. But as a whole, it was a chance for them to contribute to the war effort in their own way. So although they could not be fighting on the front lines with a gun in hand, this was the way that they could fight at home. Here you see a propaganda poster from the First World War, and it says, "Women are working day and night to win the war. 25,000 pounds immediately needed for the women's wartime funds to provide restrooms, canteens, and hostels." So this is a picture of 3 women working in a munitions factory, and you see the YWCA is clearly in support in the back, but they wanted to house the women at these factories. They wanted to provide them places to stay overnight and sleep, places to eat. So really, their whole life could be that work at the munitions factory, because we needed to produce so much for the war. And women really stepped into those roles and took on these heavy-duty jobs and worked them 24/7 throughout the war. So here we have 2 pictures of different women doing various things that they usually wouldn't do outside of the war. So here we do have women working in a munitions factory. It was a very dangerous work. You had to be very careful. The uniforms, obviously, not the traditional slacks and a sweater or anything that the men would wear. They still wore dress coats and dresses, and you had to make sure that you didn't have any metal in your shoes or metal hairpins or anything, because that could maybe cause a spark and it could be dangerous. So you see women with the hats on top of their head to protect their hair. So working in a very dangerous environment. And you can see how many women there are within the factory. Tons. These were massive opportunities for large groups of women to actually go out and make some money, gain some independence, and work in their own ways in the public sphere. Remember, we talked about how women were very much involved in the private sphere at the turn of the century. Well, now they're very much coming into the public sphere. Here we also see women, probably upper-class women, they're practicing at a shooting range. So they're preparing to defend their family if they have to. Another way that women served throughout the First World War was as nursing sisters. This is a fairly common idea about women's roles within the wars, as serving as nurses. So in the First World War, around 3,141 women served as nursing sisters in the Canadian Army Medical Corps. So these were a group of women that were specifically hired to serve as nurses for the Canadian Army and for the Allies. They worked in hospitals, on ships, and as field ambulance units. So they would work in field hospitals near the trenches or in already established hospitals throughout France and Belgium and all throughout the front lines. They worked on ships, so hospital ships started to develop, where they would assist people who were fighting on the seas, or they would also be able to dock close to the edges of France, on the shores there, and they could assist people on the ships rather than having them on land. And they served as field ambulance units. So these were very mobile units that would essentially rush into the front lines and gather the men who needed care and take them back to the hospital, whether it was driving a car or actually just going in with your boots on and a stretcher in hand and trying to pull someone out of the trenches just like that. It was very difficult work. Now, to be a nursing sister, you did have to meet certain requirements. So you had to have previous nurses training. So you had to already be a nurse. They weren't necessarily going to train you right off the bat. We see that a little more in World War II, that they are more accepting of anyone who's willing to volunteer. But in World War I, it was pretty strict on who could actually be a nurse, and you had to already have those skills. You then had to be between the ages of 21 and 38 years old. And with that went having good moral character and being in good physical health. So they wanted you to essentially be a good person who they could trust, but it also meant falling into the idea of being a good moral person at this time, which was someone who went to church, someone who respected their parents, someone who probably wasn't married at this time, because a married woman wouldn't go off to be a nurse in the war. So more than likely they were all single. And to be in good physical health, you had to be able to carry bodies and wade through mud and do a lot of physical work as a nurse. And then, of course, you had to be a British citizen as well. So nursing sisters themselves were also nicknamed the Bluebirds because of their blue uniforms and white veils. So we can see that here in this lovely colorized photo from World War I. And you see the nice light blue uniforms with the dark blue capes and coats and the big white veils. So it was a very dangerous job, as we discussed, as they were working near the front lines. So they were often the ones who were going in and getting the bodies from the trenches. They weren't necessarily the ones going into no man's land, but it was still a very, very dangerous job. They were in the line of enemy fire a lot of the times. Hospitals were known to be bombed as well. And about 58 nurses, Canadian nurses I should specify, died during the war. So here is a great heritage minute about the nursing sisters. So I very much suggest that you pause this video, watch the heritage minute, and then continue on. Okay, so let's talk about what else happened to women during the war. Something very important happened, and women got the right to vote. So here we have votes for women. If you've seen Mary Poppins, you've probably heard this song. The women got the vote in 1917. So the Wartime Elections Act gave certain women the right to vote. So during the war in 1917, an election was called, and they have all their soldiers overseas who are able to still vote. They're set up voting stations overseas as well. But it is decided that nursing sisters and women with husbands, brothers, and sons who are fighting overseas are allowed to vote as well. So this is a very big step in women's suffrage and women getting the right to vote. We had been given the right to vote in provincial elections, but never in a federal election before. However, this didn't necessarily include all women. Asian women and men and Indigenous women and men living on reserves were excluded from this. So Japanese and Chinese women were not able to vote, and then Indigenous women who were living on reserves were not able to vote as well. And like I said, this was the first time women, so mainly British women, mainly white women, black women could vote as well, were able to vote in a federal election. And we all of a sudden see at this point in time that the propaganda switches to the election. So it switches kind of away from enlistment into the war into being for the election and voting for the election. And they very much focus the propaganda towards women, because all of a sudden women can vote, and this is this new audience that they have for their propaganda. So here you see a really great example of the propaganda poster where it's a mother saying goodbye and God bless you, my son, and how he's doing his duty, but I'm also going to do mine and vote. And then it tells you which government. So vote for the Union government, vote for the Union. And then here we see an actual voting station set up in France in the front lines. And you see a lineup of nursing sisters probably registering for the very first time to vote. And there they are. They get to go and they get to vote. And then again, another great propaganda poster. Women save the lives of your soldier heroes, and you can do that by voting. And all of a sudden, now you're entitled to vote. These men who years prior did not want you to vote, did not think you deserved the right to vote, all of a sudden are saying, well, you're entitled to. So it's a big switch that we have here. So women got the right to vote through what was called the Wartime Elections Act. So let's explore this a little more in depth. So Robert Borden, the prime minister at the time, put in place the Wartime Elections Act in 1917. This was very much a political strategy to help him win the election. So Borden and his conservatives wanted conscription. We're going to talk about conscription a little later, but essentially it was forced enlistment, so forced service in the military. And Borden wanted to put in place conscription, even though in years prior he said that he wouldn't do it. But all of a sudden in 1917, we've lost many men. There have been very bloody battles, especially at the Somme. So now he wants to boost our enlistment numbers and enforce conscription. But the liberals do not support conscription. They don't want it. They want everyone to have a choice on whether they serve or not. So Borden, to get reelected in 1917, he puts in place the Wartime Elections Act and gives the right to women to vote. So gave women serving overseas and their relatives the ability to vote. But he did that because they were more likely to vote for Borden and vote for conscription, because they would be more likely to support conscription. With their husbands, brothers, and sons serving overseas, they wanted them to have as much support as possible. So if you have a family member serving, you want to make sure that they're safe. You want to make sure that there's enough soldiers and supplies for them. And if you're being told that all of a sudden our enlistment numbers are down, and maybe you're picturing that your significant other is alone on the front lines, that's a very scary thought. So women, a lot of women were very pro-conscription. So the Wartime Elections Act is a political strategy for sure. It gives women the right to vote, but it also took away the right to vote from others. So it took away the right to vote from enemy aliens who had been born in enemy nations after 1902. So that was anyone who was born in Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Ukraine area, anywhere that was at that point in time ruled by the Central Powers or the Triple Alliance. They were deemed enemy aliens because they were seen as not trustworthy. So Borden took away their right to vote, meaning that they all of a sudden, even if they had been living here for over 10 years and probably had voted for Borden or others in the past, they all of a sudden lost the right to vote just because of where they were born. It also took away the right to vote from conscientious objectors. We're going to talk about who those people are in a little bit. But essentially, they were people who did not support violence and did not support war. So the conscientious objectors and even the enemy aliens were probably more likely to oppose conscription. So that's why Borden took away the right to vote from them. He gave the right to vote to people he thought would vote for conscription and took away the right to vote from those who he thought would oppose it. So what would you guys be doing during the First World War? You would have played a very important role. Now, teenage girls at this time, your rules were definitely limited on what you could do, but you would have gone to school, you would have come home, you would have helped your mother, whoever was at home, probably making care packages for soldiers, knitting and sewing socks and anything, providing resources for families who have lost loved ones, volunteering at churches, really anything that you could do to volunteer and help in a more, I'll be honest, a more domestic sense. However, teenage boys got a very interesting opportunity, and they were called soldiers of the soil. So teenage boys were encouraged to go work on farms to replace the men who had gone to war. So all of a sudden, like with the women having to fill the roles, teenagers were often offered this opportunity as well. So the Canadian Food Board started this initiative called Soldiers of the Soil. And essentially what it was you would work for 3 months and receive room and board and spending money. And you were also exempt from school while you were working. So this was very enticing for the teenage guys at the time. This was something that would offer you a little bit of freedom and some independence. You could go away from home, probably for the first time, go do some hard work and make some money for yourself. So all of a sudden you would have some actual spending money that you could go, you buy something nice for yourself, and you had that little taste of freedom. And then of course you also didn't have to do school. The name Soldiers of the Soil and the uniform that you see here, also very strategic. We talked about how those, there were many on the front lines who had forged their age. So they had said they were a lot older than they were. So we saw the 15-year-old, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds, anyone who could pass as slightly older could go to war. So there was this very much want within the teenagers at the time, the youth at the time, to be a part of the war in any way that they could and to be a soldier. And you were very much told as a boy at this time that your duty was to be a soldier when you came of age. And all of a sudden, you're getting this opportunity to step into that role at home. It's definitely safer, but you now can potentially call yourself a soldier and have that bit of pride for yourself. So food as well. Food was very much seen as something to be saved and sent overseas for the soldiers. And there was less imports from other areas of the world because of the war going on. So women as a whole were encouraged to avoid wasting food, as food and resources needed to be sent overseas first. So there were different initiatives throughout. So the public was encouraged to eat meatless Fridays. So good meat like beef and things were seen to be sent overseas. So women were encouraged to cook fish or eat more vegetables or eat more carbs like potatoes. They also started victory gardens. So victory gardens allowed families to grow their own food in the city. So in areas where you didn't have a farm or a plot of land to actually grow a garden and grow vegetables, in the cities, they dedicated plots of land where you could go and you can actually do that for yourself and help sustain yourself throughout the winters and throughout the summers as well. And then, like with the election, we see a lot of propaganda being geared at women again, but specifically around food. So we see one here that says, waste not, want not, prepare for winter, save perishable foods, and preserve. And then we have another one. This was also produced in French as well. And it says, will you help the women of France save wheat? So basically, it talks about at the bottom how they're struggling against starvation and trying to feed not only themselves and children, but the husbands who are fighting in the trenches. So France is helping support all the men overseas, or all the men on the front line, sorry. So we need to do our bit while we're here in Canada to essentially save our own wheat here and save our stuff here so we can send it to them so France doesn't have to starve itself. And then hoarding was a big issue as well. So are you breaking the law? Patriotic Canadians will not hoard food. And you see hoarded flour, hoarded sugar. It was very much a fear of everyone that all of a sudden we would have a flour shortage, we would have food shortages. So you see people who start to hoard food, so they do make it against the law to do so to make sure we don't have a crisis where all of a sudden the shelves are empty. And it's very interesting because we definitely saw that with this pandemic throughout the spring through the summer. It was a little scary sometimes when you would go into the grocery stores and you would see some shelves that were bare, meat sections that were bare, because people were starting to hoard food. For a while, you could not get flour anywhere. You could not get baking powder anywhere. You could not get yeast anywhere. Toilet paper, of course. So we can now understand a little bit better why hoarding at this time during the war was made illegal, because we could see how scary it can be and how much of a panic it can create. And it's not necessary. So how do you pay for war? So we're sending all these men overseas. Somehow we have to pay them because you do get a salary as a soldier. You have to clothe them. You have to feed them. You have to pay for all these guns and munitions that you're making. So how do you do that? Well, they did that through what was called war bonds or victory bonds. So the public was encouraged to buy war bonds to help them finance the war. Basically, you would buy a war bond and you'd get a certificate. And that money that you used to buy the war bond would go to help the war effort, go to the government. After the war, it was said that you could bring that certificate back and you would get your money back plus interest. So you'd get a little extra money and you would avoid taxes as well. Now, it seemed like a very good thing because you could make some money off of it. However, it was also a bit of a risk because you didn't know when the war was going to end. If you started buying war bonds in 1915 and then all of a sudden it's 1918 in January and money's getting tighter and you have all these war bonds, you don't know when the war is going to end. So it can be a little scary. But a lot of people did buy it because it was seen as your duty. And again, propaganda heavily throughout the home front, very much aimed at buying war bonds. So here we see buy your victory bonds. This guy very much reminds me of the Uncle Sam character that you see with the I want you, point and stare. Then we have one that actually, if you read this here, it says, if ye break faith, we shall not sleep. Those are lines from the Flanders Fields poem by John McCrae. So once it was published in the magazine, it became very, very popular, and they used it for propaganda. And again, here we see more examples of propaganda posters. So conscientious objectors, who were they? Well, conscientious objectors refused to engage in military service or go to war because doing so would conflict with their personal beliefs. So you have this internal belief that war is bad, violence is bad, you cannot harm others. Usually, not always, but usually it correlates with a specific religious group. So Mennonites, Quakers, and Doukhobors all tend to be conscientious objectors because they do not believe in violence. The Military Services Act, so conscription, again, we'll talk about that a little later, allowed for exemptions for conscientious objectors. So even when forced service came to be, you could still apply for an exemption. And if you were a conscientious objector, so you didn't believe in going to war or military service, you could be exempt from it. You could avoid it. Now, conscientious objectors were not treated very well in the public. They were very much made fun of. You can see two political cartoons here, which very much pose the conscientious objectors as these thin, frail men with these wide eyes, pale faces, who look very scared. And if you read the captions, it's very much making fun of them and calling them weak in some way or another. So the War Measures Act. This is another act. So we have the Wartime Elections Act. We also have what's called the War Measures Act. This was put in place in September 1914. So right as the war had started, remember we declared war in August, so a month later in September, the War Measures Act comes out. Now this gave the government broad powers to maintain security and order in Canada. So essentially this gives them a lot of power over society in Canada at the time. The government could censor and suppress communication, arrest, detain, or deport people without trial or charges, control all trade and transportation and manufacturing, and seize private property. That is a lot of control. One, being able to censor communication, so that means you control what people say and read. So they could shut down newspapers, they could shut down magazines. If they didn't like what certain people were saying in the media, they could stop them. They had that power to do so. Today, we tend to think of censorship being within Nazi Germany or within heavily communist and countries run by dictators. But the War Measures Act during World War I gave the Canadian government the same abilities. Being able to arrest, detain, or deport people without trial or charges is also a big thing. Now, when you go to arrest someone, you need a warrant and you need cause. You need to prove that this person has done something or that you have just cause to arrest them. Back then, you did not with the War Measures Act. You could arrest anyone and hold them without any trial or charges being pressed. And then controlling trade and transportation and manufacturing is very big because it takes it out of the hands of businessmen and puts it in the arms of the government. And then being able to seize private property is also bad or big. Sorry, I should say big and bad too, because they could take over people's houses. They could take over people's land if they needed it. They could take weapons as well. And we're going to see how this impacted certain groups in just a second. So internment. Part of the War Measures Act and the power that it gave the government also meant that they could intern people, so they could arrest or detain people. So internment is when you are being confined as a prisoner for political or military reasons. With the War Measures Act, Canada labeled certain people enemy aliens. And we've talked about enemy aliens. They're immigrants who came from countries at war with Canada, so Austria-Hungary, Germany, Ukraine. And essentially, they took these enemy aliens and they interned them in camps. So they imprisoned them in camps. And you can see a picture here. You see posts with barbed wire fencing keeping them in. And they interned over 8,500 people throughout Canada. That is quite a few people. The majority were Ukrainian. And they just did so because they were born in a different country. They didn't have to be violent people. They didn't have to be criminals at all because your birth certificate said that you were from a different country meant that they wanted to put you in prison. That's because they were scared. They didn't know if these people were loyal to their home country where they were born, or if they were loyal to Canada. They were also just different people. They spoke different languages, had different values, and to the Canadian government and to other Canadians, that was scary in a time of war. So they thought the best thing to do was to exert their power with the War Measures Act and imprison these people for the duration of the war. Another 80,000 Ukrainian Canadians were forced to register and carry ID papers. So they would have to go, and we have an actual, not advertisement, but more of like a call to attention here, saying that you have to go, if you're from one of these countries, you have to go register as enemy aliens at an office in Toronto. They're going to give you ID papers to prove who you are, and essentially that would put you on a list for internment or not. If you were interned, you worked on large labor projects like building roads, taking down forests, anything that was essentially going to just be manual labor work. And entire families were interned at times. Sometimes just the men were moved, but they would leave their homes and personal property was confiscated. So homes could be confiscated. You might leave internment, which lasted until the 20s. And all of a sudden your house is gone. Someone else is living there. Their personal property, any like money, extra clothing, anything they had on them could have been taken as well. They also took the weapons of those who registered. So if you were a man and you had a rifle or any gun or weapon at all, they would take it from you. Even if you weren't being interned, you were still seen as a threat. So propaganda, I've pointed out several pieces of propaganda, but then this is just a good review. It's information promoting one side of a political cause or point of view. It was all over the home front, used to very much promote war and wartime objectives, and it was aimed at very specific groups. So each piece of propaganda has a very specific audience, whether it's men of age to enlist, women, children, anyone. There was also another form of propaganda that was more of a physical form of propaganda, not necessarily just a poster, but it was called the White Feather Campaign. And this was a campaign that had started in the UK, and women would go around and they'd hand out white chicken feathers to men who were not in uniform, so men who did not enlist, because this would label them as a coward, as a chicken feather. Now, this was supposed to be a way to shame people into enlisting, but it also became a big issue because sometimes men would come home on leave and they would just be in regular clothing and not in their uniforms. So they would be nervous and they would get a white feather, even though they had served overseas. Or sometimes people couldn't serve for a medical reason that wasn't visible, or they had already come home and done their time. So a lot of men were wrongfully given white feathers, and it caused a lot of shame and a lot of fear as well. So a lot of men would just go out wearing their military uniform if they were home on leave, because they didn't want to be shamed or didn't want people to think that they hadn't enlisted. So these are some examples of propaganda posters. Go through them, see what stands out to you, look at the images, look at the wording, see what techniques that they use for propaganda. So that was the main part of the fill in the blank note. Now we're going to go over your independent work for the rest of the Homefront study. So you're going to take a virtual tour across Canada by visiting key sites of memory in Canada for World War I via slideshow. You're going to consider these questions. So how our actions, responses, and decisions are remembered and commemorated across Canada. So basically, how do we remember what happened on the home front? And we're going to complete the Google forms as you go and submit the Google Forms at the end for completion marks. So let's go on to World War I Canada. So as you visit each site, open up the Google form. So click this icon here, and there will be 4 questions for you to answer about each site. So on the first site that we go to about internment, you're going to click the purple document and you're going to answer those 4 questions and then hit submit. On the next site, you're going to do the same thing. Click the purple icon, answer those 4 questions, click submit. Okay, so as you see here, our very first stop in Canada is a site of memory for internment. So what you're going to do is you're going to watch the video, use the information from the video to help you answer the questions. If you feel like you need a little more to help you understand internment or one of the other sites, you're going to click these links here. So there's a Heritage Minute about internment. There's a CBC article. The Heritage Minute, I believe, was made by someone not Historical Canada, but it's still fun. So a CBC article about internment and some Ukrainian information. So this is all extra reading that you can do if you want to learn a little more. So you're going to explore a site about internment, a site about training Polish soldiers, which is very close to us. It's in Niagara-on-the-Lake. You're going to explore the Women Dominion Arsenal, and the Chinese Labor Corps. So after you have explored all that and you've gone through the Google forms, you're going to use the evidence from the virtual tour activities to answer the questions in the D2L discussion area. So look at these questions, pause the video, head to D2L, and complete these questions. So which sites do you consider the two most significant? So out of those four, which do you think are the two most significant? To what extent do actions, events on the home front represent things to make you proud? So now you're actually going to discuss that question that you should have been thinking about this whole time. So at the end, make sure you've completed all Google Forms and you've completed all discussions. Once you've done that, you can look at our culminating activity for World War I. So our culminating activity for World War I is going to be a historical perspective letter. Now, I've put it here in this slideshow because it very much ties into the theme of the home front. So if you click the pictures here, it will bring you to a Google Doc and you can read through the activity. Before you start the activity, however, I want you to continue on to the conscription part of this lesson, the conscription slideshow. That's going to give you information on what conscription is and what happened with conscription that you can use to complete this activity, okay? So basically in this activity, you're going to be writing a letter in role as someone in the First World War. If you have questions about it, please, please, please don't feel afraid to email me. Make sure you read through the rubric as well so you can see how you're going to be assessed. So that is the bulk of our information about the home front on World War I. Again, any questions, please reach out to me, guys. Have a good day.